Everyone, and welcome to our Midcast podcast live stream. I am your host, Mnar Adley. This is an interview series featuring dissenting voices the establishment would rather silence. I really appreciate you guys joining us today. If you support this series, which we've been publishing and broadcasting a weekly live stream pretty much every single week, you can support us on our Patreon page and help us with beating social media big tech censorship by sharing this live stream on your pages. Today, we are joined by a very special guest. Many of you may already know her. Her name is Rania Khalek. Rania, thank you so much for joining us today.
It's great to be on with you, Mnar.
Thank you. So you're a journalist for Breakthrough News and co-host of the Unauthorized Disclosure podcast, and you are now living in Lebanon, which is under U.S. sanctions and experiencing an economic crisis. It's an honor to have you here, Rania, with us. I want to talk about Lebanon because I think it's so important to discuss just the ramifications of how U.S. sanctions can truly affect a nation that is on the brink of an economic crisis. I mean, is it on the brink or is it in an economic crisis? Explain it to us.
Lebanon has been collapsing economically since 2019. So it just keeps falling and falling, and it hasn't hit the floor yet. And it's going to keep getting worse. And it's pretty bad already. And you mentioned sanctions, and I'm glad you did, because oftentimes the way that the crisis in Lebanon is portrayed is as if it was its own doing, right? It's just a matter of, mismanagement and deep corruption, and, a political elite that just won't let go of power. And these things are true about Lebanon for sure. Lebanon has a very dysfunctional political system, and it is under the control of essentially an oligarchy. The oligarchs are basically the former warlords who fought the civil war back, in 1975 to 1990. But that's not the entire story. What's left out of that very incomplete picture is that Lebanon is also suffering from conditions that have been created in the region by U.S. imperialism. And what I mean by that is, Lebanon is a tiny country that borders Syria, it borders Israel to its south, and then it borders, the Mediterranean Sea. It's a small country of about 6 million people, including a lot of refugees. And its entire economic system was set up by America's allies in the country and blessed by America's allies in the country. It ultimately was this Ponzi scheme economy that was inevitably going to crash. It just took 30 years. And now that it has crashed, Lebanon's in a situation where it's kind of under this sort of unofficial siege. And what I mean by that is, it has Syria on one side that is under U.S. sanctions, under the Caesar Act of the U.S., which actually, it's not just sanctioning Syria, it prevents other countries from doing trade with Syria. So if a country like Lebanon, which literally is Syria's neighbor, trades with Syria, Lebanon will be subject to secondary U.S. sanctions, and it can't afford to do that right now. So that's one trading partner that's cut off. I mean, Syria, Lebanon used to get, I think, 10 to 15% of its power needs, its electricity needs from Syria. And it can no longer do that because if it buys power from Syria, it'll be subject to U.S. sanctions. And then, of course, to the south is Israel, is occupied Palestine. And Lebanon doesn't trade with Israel for obvious reasons. Israel is an official enemy state that's launched several wars against Lebanon and continues to bomb Lebanon with, routinely. And, that's not talking about every day that it violates Lebanese airspace with its fighter jets and its drones. So that's off the table. Lebanon can't trade with Israel. And then you have the port, the Beirut port, which, yesterday was the 1-year anniversary of the Beirut port explosion, which destroyed Lebanon's its largest and most important port. And as a result, Lebanon is an import dependent country. It produces almost nothing except for banks, which have all failed. So it's dependent on importing things into the country. And so now there's all these shortages. There's medicine shortages, there's fuel shortages. The country, I'm in the capital, and Beirut is experiencing up to 22-hour-a-day blackouts. And so everyone's dependent on generators. The reason I have electricity right now is because I have a building generator. But even that, we're starting to have to ration because we can't find fuel for the generator. So it's, snowballing into a bigger and bigger crisis because of Lebanon's economic collapse. But, and these are the sanctions in the region not just in Syria, also the sanctions on Iran impact Lebanon. Lebanon is desperate for fuel, but it lacks the dollars to purchase it. So Iran actually offered to sell Lebanon fuel in Lebanese currency, which is essentially like giving it to Lebanon for free because Lebanese currency is so worthless right now. And despite how desperately Lebanon needs that fuel, the half of the political class that hates Iran and is pro-US, said absolutely not, because if we do this, we'll be subject to sanctions. So Lebanon can't even get oil from Iran, which is not that far away. It can't get power from Syria. It has a dollar shortage and can't buy fuel. And then all these outside powers that sustained Lebanon's economy for so long because they were hoping that the pro-Saudi, pro-US politicians could take power away from Hezbollah. Because that never happened, they're now just kind of letting Lebanon fall because they figure, you know what, it's a lost cause. Hezbollah is going to be in charge. They're going to maintain support and popularity in that country. Just let it fall. And then that's not even to mention, the sanctions that actually are on Lebanon. Lebanon does have sanctions on it, particular individuals. Anything affiliated with Hezbollah is sanctioned, despite the fact that Hezbollah is a political party in Lebanon that is voted democratically into parliament and is a part of Lebanon's majority coalition. The head of the Lebanese party, the Free Patriotic Movement, Gibran Bassil, was recently sanctioned by the Americans. They say it's for corruption, which there probably is corruption involved. He's a rich guy. He's a part of a rich family. His family's benefited from the economic structure in Lebanon, but so is every other political party and all their oligarchs as well. I mean, there's nothing special about this guy that he's more corrupt than, say, Saad Hariri. But he's being sanctioned because his party, the biggest Christian party in Lebanon, is allied with Hezbollah. And that, exactly. So that it always goes back to Hezbollah and trying to weaken Hezbollah. And so sanctions on, even if you don't sanction a country entirely, maybe the way the US has sanctioned Syria, if you sanction people who are in power, you sanction a political party that's in power, you're essentially scaring international investors away from the country. So even before this economic crisis, it was actually difficult to do banking between Western banks and Lebanese banks because of all the scrutiny, because of Hezbollah, and because of US sanctions and just this constant fear. No company wants to be subjected to financial penalties from US sanctions. So if you sanction a few individuals, it actually ultimately does impact the country's ability to attract investors and to just buy things on the international market.
So let's talk about the power structure in Lebanon, because I think it's so important. I mean, what you just did is describe kind of this overarching crisis, right, that's taking place in Lebanon. But it's so important for the average American audience to understand the power dynamics, the structure there. The country is really divided in terms of politics and political affiliations. You have the oligarchs, right, who are very much affiliated with, Western imperialism. They're allied with the United States. They're allied with Saudi Arabia. I mean, their politicians are flying back and forth to Saudi Arabia anytime there's a crisis in Lebanon to escape any sort of prosecution, right? Mm-hmm. But then when we hear about Lebanon in crisis in the West, the finger is always pointed to Hezbollah, the political party from the South, right? And so explain to me kind of the power structure and dynamics that's taking play here, and who really is at fault for the current economic crisis.
So Lebanon is a really complicated place. It's a small country, so you'd think it would be simple, but it's not. The reason is this political structure that was put into place after the Civil War. The Civil War ended in 1991, and when the Civil War ended, what ended them was something called the Taif Accords, which basically distributed power among different sects. The idea was to have representation among all the sects to prevent sectarianism, but of course the opposite ends up happening. So you have the situation in Lebanon where the president has to be a Maronite Christian, the prime minister has to be Sunni, and the speaker of parliament has to be Shia. And so that kind of distribution, that imposed distribution is reinforced throughout every structure in Lebanon, where this person has to be this everyone's allotted something. But what that has done is it's reinforced clientelism in Lebanon, and it's actually reinforced sectarianism in Lebanon. But that's not actually the main problem in Lebanon. I mean, sectarianism in Lebanon is an issue, and having a sectarian system is a problem, but ultimately it's the neoliberal economic order that came with that structure. And that economic order, that Ponzi scheme economy, was architected by two individuals in particular, by a guy called Riyad Salemi, who's been the head of the central bank, and he's been a very close ally of the State Department, and has played a huge role in kind of making sure that U.S. sanctions are imposed and even go further than they need to, but very close to the State Department. And then there's a guy that was called Rafi al-Hariri, who was killed. And now his son has taken over his place as the head of the Future Party, which is essentially a Saudi-backed, U.S.-backed party. And when I say backed, I actually doesn't really describe it well enough. It's a party where literally all of its PR was done by America. All of its PR was paid for by Saudi Arabia. Saad Hariri is a Saudi citizen. Sometimes, I wonder if they're holding his family hostage or something because of how much sway they have over him. They actually kidnapped him a few years ago and forced him to resign as prime minister. But anyways, the Hariri clan, which made a ton of money off of real estate after the Civil War, billions of dollars, and benefited from the system, as well as Riyad Salemi, architected this system, and they continued to benefit from this system, and they continued to be backed and bailed out every time the system almost collapsed by the U.S. government, by Saudi Arabia and their allies for the last 30 years, because they were seen as being necessary to be an alternative to Hezbollah, to be the pro-U.S. bloc. And the system, this is a very neoliberal system in Lebanon where it's, when I say it had the blessing of the West, I mean that this guy, Riyad Salemi, head of the central bank, even as he was doing this so-called financial engineering to keep the Lebanese system afloat, which was constantly dependent on outside deposits coming into the country to keep funding the economy. Literally, commercial banks, depositors' money in commercial banks in Lebanon was being used by the central bank to fund the country's imports, which is actually unheard of. That's not usually how an economy functions. But as a result, the functioning of the country, the ability of the country to import fuel and import medicine and pay for these things in US dollars was dependent on a constant inflow of people depositing their money into commercial banks. And the way they kept this inflow coming in was to offer higher and higher interest rates until it just became too high for people to believe it anymore. But these are the guys who architected this system. And until a few years ago, Riyad Salemi was getting prizes at international banking conferences by international institutions. The World Bank loved him. The IMF loved him. The people at Davos loved him, right? They were like, this man's a magician. Lebanon was able, under his rule of the central bank, was able to withstand the 2008 global financial collapse that the U.S. caused, and it wasn't hurt by it. And so everyone thought he was like a wizard or something. And they were bowing down to him. I mean, he's a guy who comes out of Merrill Lynch. That's where he was working before he came to head the Lebanese central bank. And so despite the fact that the economy crashed because of this Ponzi scheme created by these powers that are totally tied up with America and its financial institutions and imperialism, somehow the Western media manages to blame Hezbollah. Hezbollah doesn't even have a stake in the Lebanese banking system because they've been under sanction. They've had to always operate outside of it. So even if they wanted to be a part of this system, this very corrupt banking system, they couldn't, because sanctions literally prevented them from doing international banking. And so it's just so absurd that the U.S. is blaming Hezbollah and that Western media blames Hezbollah or Iran, because the parties at fault for Lebanon's financial collapse are America's biggest tools in Lebanon.
And it's always, looking at any neoliberal system, it always goes back to the real estate moguls and the big banksters. And that's really what's happening in Lebanon. But let's talk about how the people are coping. Clearly the 1% class in Lebanon is lavishing with, living a very lavish lifestyle, while the people are truly suffering. I have friends, I have some family that live in Lebanon, and they're really suffering right now from the electrical blackouts. 12 hours a day or more with no electricity. How are you surviving, Rania? All of this.
Well, so actually, I was largely, I can hear myself echoing. I don't know if you can hear it. Okay. Well, I've been largely able to Sorry, I'm trying to. Okay, now I'm not echoing. I can't hear myself think. I've been largely immune from the blackouts until the last couple of weeks because I have a building generator that's really good. So like in Lebanon, how you're doing with the electricity depends largely on what building you live in and whether your building has a good generator and was prepared to have a generator on. I mean, generators aren't really built to be on all day. But that's what's been happening in Lebanon. So basically every building has been dependent on either its generator or like a neighborhood generator. Villages have been dependent on village generators. And Lebanon has never had 24-hour state electricity since the end of the war, since before, because it's just never been able to build the infrastructure for it. There's a lot of corruption is partly the reason for that, because a lot of money has been put into the electricity sector, yet despite that, the infrastructure still isn't there. But also Israel has bombed Lebanon's power stations repeatedly over and over and over the last decades. But that's actually not why there's no electricity right now. Like everybody wants to blame the bad power infrastructure. Lebanon's always had bad power infrastructure. What's happening right now is a result of the fuel shortages. So even, like I said, I was largely immune from the state power cuts because I have a good building generator. But now we can't find fuel for the generator. So we started to ration the generator. That's what a lot of people are doing. They're rationing the fuel they use to power the generator. So there are, people who were able to make up for the lack of state electricity with their generator are now going 8 hours, 12 hours, more and more of the day without electricity because there's no fuel. It's being hoarded, and also not, there's a shortage because the country can't afford to import it because it lacks dollars, and like the situation I mentioned before. So people, it's really hot right now. Today, there's a heat wave right now. There's also forest fires, there's wildfires as a result. Lebanon has wildfires, much like we do in California. And the fuel shortage is actually making it difficult to put the wildfires out because you need fuel shortages to get the fire trucks, to get the helicopters running, all the things that you need to put out these wildfires. It's affecting water pumping. Water pumping stations rely on fuel. I mean, people really don't realize how much every activity you do every part of the day is so reliant on oil, is so reliant on some dirty fuel source until you're desperate for it, until you don't have it, until every hour that you have electricity to turn on your light and turn on an AC when there's a heat wave, then you really start to notice. But the water pumping is going to become an issue for most, like 70 to 80% of the country is at risk of not having access to like water to bathe and shower with and stuff like that, to clean with, because water pumping stations need fuel and they're relying on generators and they can't find diesel. You also have the situation with agriculture. Think about chicken. Think about poultry. You need to keep it refrigerated. That's becoming a problem. People are starting to get food poisoning because things aren't able to stay refrigerated properly because refrigeration relies on what? Electricity, which needs fuel. It's one thing after another after another. That's the electricity, the fuel issue. Then there's the issue of medicines, right? The country needs medicines, but it doesn't have dollars to import them. There's hoarding of medications by the pharmaceutical cartel. There's like a cartel for everything in this country. So for the last several months, people can't get blood pressure medications. They can't cholesterol medications. And then for those are things you can maybe go without immediate repercussions. Like if you stop taking your blood pressure medication, it's a problem in the long term. It's a very big problem, but you don't see the long-term impact, or you don't see the long-term impacts of it right away. But then there's people who have cancer and they can't get their medicine, right? They rely on medications that keep them alive. There's people who have breathing machines that they can't recharge at their homes because they don't have a generator. They're not getting electricity all day. It's just on and on and on and on. It's really terrible what's happening right now. It's affecting businesses. You can't keep your restaurant open if you can't refrigerate the food. And if you don't have power, who's going to come to your restaurant in the middle of the summer when it's 95 degrees outside and humid outside and you don't have any AC, And
our kids going to school, I guess it's summer break, but they're not going to be going to school anytime soon from this crisis, right?
Well, so yeah, kids weren't going to school because of COVID. Unlike in the US, people don't have as much access to vaccines, though there have been a good number of people vaccinated, interestingly enough, in Lebanon, but not like in the US. And so I think the plan for September is for schools to remain virtual, but then you also have a problem of how do you go to school virtually if you don't have electricity? Right. And that was a problem earlier in the year, but the electricity cuts were not as bad as once the summer started. And part of that is because the summer does put more pressure on the system. people they need ACs. There's more that you turn on. But that's going to be an issue. I have a lot of friends who are teachers. The other issue in Lebanon, speaking of education, is Lebanon had one of the best, private educational institutions in the region. A lot of people came from other countries to send their kids to school in Lebanon. Part of that was because the teachers, they had really well-paid teachers with degrees from like America and degrees from Europe. But those people have all left because their salaries are not keeping up with inflation. So even from the private schools, teachers have been leaving in droves. So the education system is definitely going to suffer from a lack of teachers in this country. I mean, these are the problems that are piling up in Lebanon are going to have consequences for decades to come. It's like going to destroy a generation.
Well, and right now people are being forced into their homes where there's no access to like proper food. There's no access to air conditioning or anything like that. So from my understanding, security forces are attacking people who are getting out on the street to protest these measures.
Well, so I actually don't really have that view of the security forces in Lebanon. Like everybody likes to make a big deal every time the security forces in Lebanon fire a tear gas canister. But maybe this is because I'm American and I've seen what brutal police look like. You just don't have that same thing in Lebanon. Like you just don't. I mean, security forces everywhere act like jerks when there's a protest. But I have to say, like people in Lebanon if you did the things that people in Lebanon do to security forces, and I'm talking about throwing punches, throwing rocks, throwing sticks, you'd get shot in the US. So it's not as, I mean, you might see a video that goes viral, like Lebanese, look what the Lebanese police did, but like it's not as, Lebanon's a difficult place to understand when it comes to protest because there's also so many political parties involved who and they're also fighting each other. So like there's like every political party has its thugs. Every political party has its thugs.
There's already political upheaval on top of what's happening.
Right.
Crisis.
Yeah. So like yesterday there was the 1 year anniversary of the port explosion. Yeah. And so people went out to protest and there was people at the parliament. They started throwing sticks and rocks at like the security forces at the parliament. And I mean, this is the equivalent of like, imagine what police would do if you did that actually, we know what police would do if you did that to Congress. They might fire at you because we saw that happen. But there was also political parties like fighting each other on the street yesterday. Like there was the Lebanese Forces Party, which is a right-wing, like fascistic party that's fully backed by the US. It's like a US stooge party. They committed some of the most horrific massacres during the Lebanese Civil War. And yesterday they attacked a group of communists from the Lebanese Communist Party in a neighborhood, in a Lebanese forces dominated neighborhood near the port, near the downtown area, near the port. And they attacked them really viciously and like forced them to step on their keffiyehs and curse Hezbollah and curse their own party. And they sent people to the hospital. They fired gunshots. Like people got shot yesterday with this firefight provoked by the Lebanese forces. So like this is happening at the same time as people are protesting over the port explosion. You have other political parties with their thugs on the street throwing rocks at security forces. So Lebanon's a little bit more complicated than just people protesting and security forces were like mean to them. There's a lot more happening. And that's why Lebanon is so ripe for like co-optation and for interference in protest movements in Lebanon. Every time there's a mass protest movement in Lebanon, like the various US-backed groups get involved, the different political parties get involved, and they try and, weaponize it to go their way. And so that's what happened in 2019. And that's why that protest movement largely didn't go anywhere, because it was really hijacked by right-wing political parties in Lebanon against Hezbollah. Like within like 3 or 4 days, like Lebanese forces was making it their protest, but pretending that they weren't Lebanese forces. Like this always happens. So the same thing is happening with the port blast. The port blast has been completely politicized. It happened, it was a fault of the entire government. It was the fault of an incompetent and criminally negligent, intentionally weak government. I mean, Lebanon has an intentionally weak government, so it can stay it can be a weak country. And as a result of that weak governing apparatus, you have that level of incompetence, bureaucratic negligence that led to the port explosion. But somehow the port explosion is again, they're trying to politicize it against Hezbollah. and trying to politicize it against Hezbollah's allies. And so the blame is not being distributed equally. And there's a lot of people getting off the hook over this, at least in the public, because of the campaign to try to make this about Hezbollah when it's about something that goes beyond Hezbollah. And that's what happened yesterday. I mean, yesterday you had people protesting rightfully because they were angry because there's been no accountability. You also had people protesting, chanting Hezbollah is a terrorist group and saying curse words about Nasrallah and then beating up Lebanese communists. So like, it's always a mess in Lebanon.
I was about to ask, so how has the country recovered since the Beirut explosion? I don't think it's recovered at all.
So, you know, the area that was, it depends which area. Like there's an area, the areas that were hit, some of them were rebuilt in a couple months by a lot of European money. In particular, like there's a neighborhood called Mnar Adley in Beirut, which is like right next to the port and was completely destroyed. It's also like it's a very Christian neighborhood, and the French feel like very close to it. So the French helped fund, the French are the former colonial masters of Lebanon. They tried to make it a Christian country. So they have a very close relationship. They feel like responsible for Lebanese Christians. So they rebuilt, their money rebuilt a lot of Mnar Adley. Like I remember I left after the port exploded. I came back like 3 or 4 months later, and every single bar and restaurant in Mnar Adley was rebuilt like it was brand new. But then there are other places that are still destroyed and nothing's been done to fix them, particularly poorer neighborhoods like Karantina, another neighborhood near the port that's still like in ruins and nothing's been fixed. So it depends where, and much like the port explosion was random, the reconstruction has been seemingly random. Not everybody's been rebuilt. And of course, most importantly, like nobody's have been held accountable for a completely preventable industrial disaster that killed over 200 people. I mean, there was a bunch of really explosive material just sitting at the port for 6 years.
Well, I mean, when the explosion happened, there were so many like theories that were spiraling out of control. What was this blast caused by?
So, I mean, there's of course, because there's always so much interference in Lebanon, and because everything that happens in Lebanon is so politicized, depending on who you ask, they'll have a different theory. Like there's people who, think it was Israel.
Right.
There's people who think Israel dropped the bomb. I mean, I haven't seen any evidence anybody dropped a bomb. It seems like a fire start. What likely looks like happened is a fire started, and there was this highly explosive material. There was reports warning about this material and how flammable it was and how it was a disaster waiting to happen. There are shady questions there are questions about this that make it shady that haven't been answered. I mean, this like 2,000 some odd tons of ammonium nitrate which is a fertilizer that also can be used to make explosives. It was on this like Russian-owned a ship owned by some Russian businessman that was apparently on its way to Mozambique. Right? That sounds shady. Like what was happening there? Why did it get stopped in Lebanon? There are theories, like there's another politicized theory that the pro-US, pro-Saudi political class has tried to push, and their oligarchic media mouthpieces have pushed, is the idea that this was being imported to Syria for the Syrian government to use against rebels. There's like no truth to this, because Syria produces ammonium nitrate for agriculture. It's a fertilizer used in agriculture. If they wanted to use it in explosives, they would not need to import it through the Beirut port. They can make it themselves. They manufacture their own. There's like a paper trail showing they manufacture their own. There is another theory that I think actually is plausible that I've heard in some security circles discussed, though it hasn't really been given any public hearing or looked into properly, is that the rebel groups in Syria, this patchwork of al-Qaeda linked jihadist groups that the U.S. and its allies in the region were arming and funding, that this was being distributed to them by their local Lebanese partners. The Future Party had people who were funneling weapons to the rebels in Syria. We know this. This isn't controversial. It's been reported on even in the mainstream. So it's plausible that that's where it was going, that the political class in Lebanon allied with those jihadist groups might have been smuggling it to them to use in explosives. And I mean, this kind of fertilizer is typically used by non-state groups who don't have access to conventional weapons. That's who would use it to make explosive. I think that's plausible. I can't prove it. It's pure speculation.
Yeah, it's not out of the question. I mean, considering the rebels in Syria, like Al-Nusra Front, have, they've been studied that they create a lot of the weapons themselves. They create chemical weapons themselves to wreak havoc in Syria. I mean, this is something MIT Press has reported on. You've reported on this fact as well. MIT researchers and scientists literally teach a class about how Al-Nusra Front is manufacturing their own weaponry and chemical weapons using these kinds of fertilizers.
Right. So I think this is a totally plausible scenario that may have played out. And there's also an interesting fact that was revealed by an FBI investigation that the Lebanese authorities agreed with the results of, which is that only 500 something tons of this explosive material actually exploded. So the question becomes, what happened to the other 1,700 tons, right? But I mean, we can't answer these questions till there's a proper investigation, but everything's just too politicized that I don't think we'll ever get to the bottom of it. Maybe until decades later. I really don't I don't think you're going to see any answers. And I don't think anyone's going to be held accountable, which is typically what happens here is no one's held accountable. But at the end of the day, Lebanon right now is suffering to such a tremendous degree and it needs help. And all of these governments are the Western governments are doing two things. They're saying, we're not going to help you until you make these reforms that are totally impossible in the system Lebanon has right now. Like reforms against corruption and stuff. It's just never going to happen. You have this political system here is structured to never have those reforms. So unless you change that system, you'll never get those reforms. So, okay, Lebanon's not going to get any help from the West. The other option is Lebanon could turn to Russia and China, turn eastward, do business with Iran, but Lebanon has a political class that is split where the pro-US, pro-Saudi side, specifically the pro-US side, is preventing that. The US has actually prevented any sort of Chinese investment in Lebanon. I know that for a fact. That was happening under the Trump administration. The US, even under the Trump administration, prevented Qatar from helping Lebanon. Biden's not doing that anymore, but there is an attempt to use this economic crisis to try to further weaken Hezbollah. It's not working. You're not going to weaken Hezbollah because Hezbollah has a base of support in Lebanon because in their community, they are seen as being a force of protection. They've protected the Lebanese South and Shias in the South against Israeli occupation, who they kicked out of southern Lebanon. I think the only group in the region that successfully used armed resistance against Israel to end their occupation. And they also, after that, they continued to protect the southern border from Israel, but they also protected the country from ISIS and Al-Qaeda in Syria, which did invade Lebanon. I mean, nobody talks about this, but ISIS and Al-Qaeda came into Lebanon. And the only reason they did not successfully take over areas of Lebanon the way they took over areas of Syria is because of Hezbollah. And of course, the Lebanese army helped, but let's be real here. Hezbollah is the actual stronger party. And that terrifies the US because Hezbollah is a total obstruction. It's a huge obstacle to US hegemony in this region. They put a huge wrench into US plans in this region, and that can't be tolerated. And we know what happens when anybody stands up and refuses to submit to American and Israeli dictates in this region, is they are crushed with every imaginable tool. And right now, the tool that's being used against them is an economic one, just like the same tools being used against Syria, just like that same economic tool of financial terrorism is being used against Iran.
And ISIS for so long, when they were united with Al-Nusra Front and other jihadi groups, when they were operating in Iraq under one umbrella to create the caliphate, across the Middle East, I mean, they had announced from the very beginning that their target was to get to Hezbollah. And so this obviously fulfills Israeli and US interests in the region. And so that's why Hezbollah has been punished so severely when it got involved in the war in Syria, because it got involved not just to help Syria, with this invasion by these jihadi groups, but to also prevent them from entering Lebanon, because that's where they were headed towards. They made it very, very clear that their main enemy was Hezbollah. It was.
Mnar, it's the same reason. It's the same reason Iran got involved in Syria. I mean, of course, Syria is their ally, and that's one aspect of it. But it's the main reason Iran got involved in Syria because this was an existential threat to their own national security. And Hezbollah, as much as everyone wants to think Hezbollah is some proxy of Iran, Hezbollah is a Lebanese group with Lebanese domestic concerns, and it views itself as protecting Lebanon's territorial integrity and Lebanon's national security. So you're exactly right. This was viewed, and rightly so, was viewed as a huge threat to Lebanon, a huge threat. And had it not been for Hezbollah, who knows how far these groups would have gotten into Lebanon. And it's, the irony, of course, is that the parties that despise Hezbollah so much, I think they would have been singing a different tune had they had to live under the black flag of ISIS.
Yes, exactly. I mean, who knows what Syria would have turned into if these groups had successfully taken over, but they didn't. Luckily, they didn't. And sovereignty in Syria, a little bit of sovereignty was restored. But I want to just wrap up about Lebanon very quickly. You mentioned this at the very beginning about how, I forgot his name, the guy heading the central bank in Lebanon.
Riyad Salemi.
So Riyad Salemi, when he is like this dream guy for the IMF and the World Bank. How does this economic crisis benefit the IMF and the World Bank?
Interestingly enough, this isn't your typical third world country in debt kind of economic crisis where they're coming in to try to privatize everything, because there's not much left to privatize or to vulture off of. Lebanon was such a paradise for the international capitalist class. It's like just a corpse, a starved corpse at this point. There's nothing left to take from. It's purely political. So it's not so much that the IMF and World Bank have anything to benefit off of so much as it's like an American imperialism kind of situation where America and Israel and their ally Saudi Arabia can try to benefit off of this economic collapse of Lebanon. That said, they don't want Lebanon to collapse completely, because they also recognize that if Lebanon had a full-on collapse, Hezbollah would just be in charge of the country, because they'd be the only people able to impose any sort of order. So they're kind of keeping Lebanon on life support, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it's like on the brink, but not totally collapsed, because when it's on the brink, people can continue to fight each other too, which is what you also described, is that there's a lot of, sectarianism is growing, political parties are fighting each other rather than pointing their fingers at the right groups who are actually creating the crisis in the first place. So let's talk about Syria. Syria is a victim of major U.S. economic sanctions. I mean, Syria has been the victim of a brutal proxy war by countries like Turkey, Qatar, Israel, Saudi Arabia, who've been arming, and the United States, of course, from the Pentagon to the State Department, arming these jihadi groups, these so-called, moderate rebels, who have destroyed the country, who have pushed sectarianism. And Syria has been really struggling to rebuild because they're targeted with US economic sanctions, and they can barely even bring medicine into the country as the world is suffering under this pandemic. Describe, Rania, what is taking place in terms of economic sanctions when it comes to Syria. What is the impact that we're seeing here?
Well, so, it's way worse than Lebanon in terms of the devaluation of the local currency is dramatically worse than Lebanon. Syrian currency is worthless at this point. The country can't afford to import anything, its essential needs. And there's also something that should be mentioned about Syria. It's been Balkanized. And it's been Balkanized in such a way that actually hurts Syrians economically even more, because, the north of Syria is under the control of jihadist groups that are allied with Turkey, or the Turkish military itself, right? In places around places like Afrin. And then of course Idlib, right, under the control of Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, which is headed by Mohammed al-Jalani, the former head of al-Nusra, which was Al-Qaeda in Syria. So Idlib is kind of it's almost like it doesn't belong to Syria anymore. They don't even use Syrian currency there. They use Turkish currency in Idlib. And they actually have better electricity in Idlib, thanks to Turkey, than the Syrian government areas do. And then you have the Northeast, which is under the control of the Syrian Democratic Forces, overseen by, I think, something like 900 or so American military personnel.
Yeah, U.S. soldiers.
who basically occupy oil fields. Like they occupy this oil field, Al Omar oil field in Deir ez-Zor, for example. And that's, I mean, so Trump said it as honestly as you'll ever hear. He said they're there to protect the oil. Now, the northeast of Syria, where the SDF, which is basically just the YPG, which is the Syrian branch of the PKK, which is a Kurdish, like, cult, you could call it's like a cult. I mean, everybody calls it some glorious leftist group, but it's basically a cult around one man, a cult of personality around this man, Öcalan, who's in prison in Turkey. But the Syrian, and it's what's funny about the Syrian YPG is one of the reasons it even exists is because of Assad, which is another story. It was kind of like allowed to, everybody likes to portray the YPG as like they want regime change, but they don't. And they've never actually fought the regime. That was never their goal. But anyways, the U.S. armed them and basically gave them the arms and weapons to defeat ISIS in these areas in the Northeast. And now that fight is over, they basically just taken over this area. So this area is under the control of the YPG, the SDF, whatever you want to call it, thanks to the Americans. And now that they have some land and power, they don't want to give it back.
Well, they ethnically cleansed that area, actually, of Syrians.
The area is not majority Kurdish. It's not majority Kurdish. Actually, still isn't majority Kurdish. They have ethnically cleansed some neighborhoods of like Arabs and Assyrians who live there. And it's just, I mean, the entire American left, that's not the entire, but the portion of the American left that's like obsessed with this group really has some blinders on about what's actually taking place in this area. But what more importantly, the land that they have in the Northeast is Syria's most fertile land. It is where 70% of Syria's wheat is grown in this area under the control of the SDF and the Americans. It's also the area where all the oil fields are. So Syria, at a time of economic destruction from U.S. sanctions that had made it impossible to import fuel or to import anything, and have also devalued the currency, making it even more difficult to buy things on the international market, even if you can get around sanctions, is now being denied its own oil and its own wheat and has to buy it back from the SDF. Syria has to purchase its own oil with money it doesn't have. So a lot of times the SDF just says no because Syria can't pay for it. So that's like the balkanization of Syria here is denying it access to its own resources as people, the majority of Syrians who live in government controlled areas are suffering from blackouts all day. They don't have electricity, except for a couple hours here and there. They don't have access to medications. I mean, what people say now is that a Lebanese ambulance has more equipment than a Syrian hospital. Syria used to have one of the best healthcare systems in the Middle East, and it was free. And now it's a disaster. People can't get cancer treatment. They can't get dialysis. They can't get things that were easily available 10 years ago before this regime change destruction started. And so everybody likes to talk about, the Syrians bomb hospitals, the Russians bomb hospitals. You should see what American policy has done to Syria's hospitals, to some of the best healthcare that used to exist in the Middle East, just completely wiped out. Because you know what sanctions do? The U.S. loves to say that sanctions have exceptions, have medical exceptions and humanitarian exceptions. But guess what? When you have a dialysis machine, you need to maintain it. You need to do maintenance on it, right? Sometimes it breaks down because it needs a replacement part. And unless you, as a sanctioned country, have factories locally producing dialysis machines, you're reliant on the international companies that make those machines. Usually they're European companies or American companies who might get the parts from China, but they make them, in their countries. Like, you need an American part to make your dialysis machine work. If you're under sanction, you can't get that part. And apply that logic to everything from medical equipment to trucks to transport food. Those truck engines break down or you need a spare part, you're screwed because you can't import it. And that's even if you have fuel for the truck. I mean, Syrians have to wait in these long lines, in these long queues to get gasoline and to get bread. And again, this is a country that used to be very well off, where now 80 to 90% of its population is living in severe poverty. And you've got malnutrition developing. It's just a complete disaster, and it's totally preventable. It's all man-made. America.
It sounds exactly like what took place in Libya before the U.S. invasion. I mean, Libya had the highest lifestyle of living was in Libya. Free healthcare, literacy rates were so low, people were very healthy, living a much better lifestyle. And now like slaves are being, bought and sold on the streets of Libya after the United States invaded there and continued their.
It's so infuriating because not that this is okay to do to any society, but what the U.S. has done with its neoconservative foreign policy for the last 30 years, it's on a mission successfully to shatter some of the most ancient places in the world. I mean, Baghdad, Damascus, these are Aleppo. These are some of the oldest cities in the world, and they are in ruins now. Well, Damascus isn't in ruins, but
that's a colonial tactic of control and erasure of, these ancient cities in history. So that these countries, when they do rebuild, they rely so heavily on American corporations or Western corporations or European corporations, and then everything is rebuilt, in an American Western way. It's all about globalization, right? It's all globalization from there. I was going to ask you about how the United States is occupying 1/3 of Syria's landmass. We talked a little bit about that, but let's talk a little bit more about the resources that they are occupying. I mean, most people think that the United States, people think that the war in Syria is over, but it's it's far from over. It's far from over. The United States is occupying 1/3 of Syria's landmass, and that landmass is the most fertile, where they have the most access to water, gas, and oil. Talk to me about the U.S. military presence in this area.
They literally just occupy oil fields, and they also they're at the border between Syria and Iraq in an effort to basically prevent any trade coming from Iraq to the Syrian government, or they have this belief that there's a land bridge from Tehran to Beirut, a Shia land bridge. This is literally the language that the American government has used. I mean, some of the most jihadist talking points I've ever heard have come from American lobbyists on K Street against the Shia land bridge from Tehran to Beirut. But they're obsessed with this idea of the resistance axis, which actually their policies have helped create. There wouldn't be a resistance axis without American imperialism in the region.
Exactly. It's a response to American imperialism.
Exactly. And so they obviously occupy these oil fields. Although I think that Biden put a pause on the American company that was profiting from selling that oil. I don't know if that's actually gone through or not. I saw a headline about it, so I have to follow up and see if that actually happened. But there was an American company based in Delaware that was profiting off of the sale of this oil that the Americans are stealing from Syria. But this is bigger than just Syria, though, because the Middle East, if you think about what the biggest threat in the Middle East would be, it would be in a region that was strong enough to maintain independence from U.S. interests. And a region that's strong would have to be unified, right? And so part of the plan across this region isn't just to balkanize Syria, it's essentially balkanizing the whole region, which is a project that has been taking place since the British and French chopped up the Middle East and split the spoils amongst themselves after the fall of the Ottoman Empire after World War I. And so, you had Iraq and Palestine were claimed by the British, Syria and Lebanon were claimed by the French, and Jordan by the British as well. And since then, every single policy of the West, and this continued after the Americans took over from the imperial position of the French and the British, every single policy in this region has been to make sure that it stays fractured. And that's been done by promoting sectarianism, by promoting right-wing groups, by promoting and by cutting up the region, imposing these colonial borders, and then actually preventing trade between them. So something that Hezbollah talks about quite often, actually, that Nasrallah talks about in his speeches, is he talks about a unified region economically, right? An economically unified region, right? Lebanon can't produce everything in Lebanon. Syria can't produce everything in Syria. Iraq can't produce everything in Iraq. These places, they don't have the biodiversity to produce and consume and everything becomes sustainable. But regionally, they absolutely do. Iraq has a lot of agriculture. Syria has a lot of factories and a lot of people who are like workers. Lebanon has ports, right? It has access to the Mediterranean Sea. If you added these together, you could have an economically viable, sustainable region that didn't have to depend on importing from Europe and importing from America and these international financial institutions for their own basic survival. Iraq has oil, for God's sakes, right? So a lot of the policies in place, and this brings you back to Syria. You asked about Syria. Well, the U.S. military has personnel also stationed at the border between Iraq and Syria, and that does prevent trade. And Nasrallah has actually mentioned that in his speech before. He's mentioned the U.S. troop presence at the border of Iraq and Syria prevents trade even from Iraq to Lebanon, prevents land trade. I mean, right now, it's not just the U.S. military presence, it's also the sanctions. Right now, Lebanon is in desperate need of fuel. Well, Egypt and Jordan have offered to send Lebanon natural gas and other forms of fuel for its electricity, to provide electricity, right? But it would have to go through Syria. And if it goes through Syria, that means that Cairo and Amman would have to pay Syria transit fees. But this is where we got into an obstacle, right? Because transit fees to the Syrian government would be in violation of the U.S. Caesar Act. And so until the U.S. gives the okay and says, well, we won't punish you for doing this, these countries who are literally neighbors can't send fuel to Lebanon.
Well, and we need to point out here that while the United States is slapping these sanctions on Lebanon, on Syria, so that they don't have these trade options with neighboring countries, the United States is actively occupying the oil fields. And Israel is actively arming groups like the SDF. They're actively arming groups in Iraq as well with the Kurds, and getting oil from those groups. Mm-hmm. And so while Lebanon and Syria are suffering and Iran is suffering from these sanctions, Israel and the United States are continuing to plunder these nations of their resources. Did I get that right, Rania?
Yes, you got that perfectly right. I couldn't have said it better.
So in terms of Israel, let's talk about Israel, because they are one of the biggest beneficiaries of these oil fields that are being occupied, and Turkey, of course. We didn't really talk about Turkey a lot, but Turkey is as well. But I want to talk about Israel more. Israel is one of the biggest beneficiaries of the Kurds occupying oil fields in Iraq and then also in Syria. So, and then Israel also has been recently hitting Syria with airstrikes and drone strikes. So what is Israel's role in this current crisis that we're talking about here?
I mean, Israel is so in so many ways, Israel's at the center of a lot of it, because Israel's this arm of American imperialism in the region. It's America's police in the region. And that's its purpose as the settler colonial entity, to be like America's guard dog, if you will, right? And so Israel in Syria is, sometimes you can't, Israelis and Americans don't understand things as well as they think they do. They think Iran is everywhere in Syria. So they think that when they're hitting Syria, they think that they're weakening Iran. They're obsessed with, especially Israel. Israel's obsessed with the idea that Iran, and they just see Hezbollah as an extension of Iran. That Iran, and through Hezbollah, is getting strong in Israel to one day attack Israel. So it's getting strong in Syria to one day attack Israel. So Israel regularly bombs Syria. Regularly. And they're just allowed to do it. Nobody says anything. Sometimes I think that there's some sort of State Department automated messaging system that just goes into effect whenever anybody hits Israel back. It automatically is Israel has a right to defend itself. But Israel every single day is provoking every country around it. It violates Lebanese airspace every single day to spy on Syria, to spy on Lebanon, to scare the Lebanese. And it bombs Syria every month, sometimes several times a month. And no one ever says a word. No one. And it kills people when it does it. Sometimes it bombs and nobody dies. Other times it actually kills people. It kills Syrian soldiers. Sometimes they kill Hezbollah soldiers. Sometimes there's been a couple times where they actually have killed Iranians who aren't even fighting in Syria. They're just there in an advisory capacity. They don't have bases in Syria. But anyways, that's what Israel sees its war in Syria as, its bombing of Syria as something it has to do to make sure Iran doesn't gain like a foothold on its border. And it's also obsessed with trying to make sure it can keep the Golan Heights forever. That's a big part of it as well. So that's what Israel's role in Syria is now. Now, before Israel's role in Syria was also arming and funding jihadist groups in the Golan, on the Syrian Golan side. And I actually reported on this. I met with people who had initially joined the rebels, and then once in the Golan area, and once they found out the rebels were working with the Israelis or were being aided by the Israelis at the border, they quit and they switched sides back to the government, because they were like, that's like that was their red line, especially for people in the Golan who maybe like some of their family live on the other side and they've been separated from each other. Maybe they lost a home in the area that Israel still occupies. So anyways, that's really Israel's role. And then there's Israel's role in the broader, more abstract, but very real sense as a Jewish state. Israel was the first sectarian state imposed on the Middle East, right? It's the first state that balkanized the Middle East by sect, where, it wasn't just European Jews that came and took over land in Palestine as settlers. They also brought in, Jewish communities from Baghdad, from Yemen. They took Jewish communities Jews have always lived in the Middle East. Their history is not the same as the history of European Jews, but it stole Jews from the Middle East, Arab Jews, brought them into the settler colony in what became Israel, and then imposed European Jewish identity onto them. So their identity, all these Arab Jews that actually make up a majority, I think, at this point of the Israeli Jewish population, their history has become the Holocaust and has become something that happened in Europe that has nothing to do with them, their ancestors in Baghdad or in Yemen or Morocco. So Israel just being the first sectarian state in the region in and of itself, was a cataclysmic event. That was the first thing first method of modern day imperialism that really societally shattered the Middle East, and it's just been ongoing since. It's Sunni, Shia, Christian,
I always cite this study that I don't remember where the study came from, but I always cite this in my speeches when I'm giving presentations about sectarianism in the Middle East. But in the year 2000, 1 year before September 11th, a survey was conducted in the Middle East to ask people who their biggest number one enemy was. And every single one of them said Israel and the United States. And the rest of the people had said in the survey, when they were asked who was the number one hero in the Middle East, it was Hezbollah. It was Hezbollah. And so the way forward since that study took place, when after 9/11, which became basically a launching pad for a US invasion into Iraq, then into Afghanistan, then into Iraq, sectarianism really was used as a tool to completely divide and conquer the Middle East region and to promote this balkanization that you very brilliantly described. And I think it's so important to note that this sectarianism is 100% a tool of Western imperialism. You cannot look at the region without truly understanding this concept and understand how divide and conquer is utilized to balkanize the Middle East. Rania, you and I have been the victim of so many attacks by sectarian Muslims and Arabs and people who claim to be experts on the region, who continuously use those sectarian cards against us when we point this out. But really, they're actually being used as tools to promote that sectarian narrative.
Exactly.
Has it gotten better? I remember 6-7 years ago, you and I were constantly being attacked.
Yeah. That was rough. That was rough. I would say that there's definitely, it's lessened in the sense that, you mentioned Hezbollah. There was there was that poll you're talking about. I mean, Hezbollah was Nasrallah was one of the most popular figures across the region, like even in Egypt, which is like a very Sunni country.
All
Yeah.
countries,
Like it's the first time that somebody has had that, I think, much popularity. And it was after the war in 2006, because Hezbollah pushed Israel out again of Lebanon successfully. And that made Nasrallah very popular. And that was very scary for the Americans. And one way they went about destroying that cross-sect popularity is they actually embarked in collusion with the Saudi intelligence chief at the time, Prince Bandar, and Dick Cheney. This was their brainchild. They embarked on a regional strategy of basically pushing anti-Shia sectarianism, pushing Wahhabi ideology, like in media. And there was actually a dramatic shift even in Al Jazeera. Al Jazeera Arabic went from being almost like a kind of resurrection of this pan-Arabism to becoming like genocidally sectarian against non-Sunnis.
And you're promoting a lot of the jihadist groups.
Yeah, like, I mean, Qatar funded al-Nusra. Like they literally funded al-Nusra. I mean, Joe Biden said it. Okay, like everybody know that it's true. They funded al-Nusra. So it was a strategy that was deployed, and it started in Iraq, but nobody really noticed it. It was kind of isolated to Iraq in a way, because what was happening in Iraq was happening in Iraq. It didn't impact people's views of the war in 2006, even though it was like the height of the civil war in Iraq between Sunnis and Shias, and like the rise of Al-Qaeda in Iraq and bombing Shia mosques, and all that Wahhabi stuff was on the rise in Iraq and being funded by Saudi Arabia. And that was having devastating impact in Iraq, but it was in Iraq, right? You didn't see that start to happen in Lebanon until 2008. Until after this policy of really using the media to ratchet and political puppets to ratchet up anti-Shia hate, to connect. I mean, it was really a campaign against Iran. It was a way to get people in the region to hate Iran and hate Hezbollah. Is you campaign hard against the Shias, and the best ideology to do that is the ideology that hates Shias the most, which is Salafi Wahhabism. And that's why it was funded. Like this was funded. It wasn't natural. I mean, yes, every place, there is some pockets of the Middle East where Salafis did exist, right? Like Wahhabism maybe existed, but to this extent, it was funded to the tune of billions of dollars. This wasn't organic, and it wasn't natural. It was what you're talking about. It was divide and conquer, and it was using this right-wing religious tyrannical genocidal ideology to fracture the region and to try and weaken opponents of American imperialism. And it worked for a time. It really did. It worked quite well. I mean, it even confused, there was an alliance between Hamas and Hezbollah that was slightly fractured because the Syrian civil war, the Hamas affiliate inside parts of Syria sided with the rebel groups because, the Hamas is affiliated with Muslim Brotherhood. And I guess in this case that trumped, the axis of resistance. And they actually they taught the jihadi rebel groups how to build tunnels, which they learned from Hezbollah, who interestingly enough learned it from the North Vietnamese, but that's another story. But anyways, they taught the rebel groups how to build tunnels, and that was seen as a huge betrayal, especially by the political leadership of Hamas. And it also, for several years, was a distraction from the cause of Palestine. But I think something very interesting that happened this year was with this recent war on Gaza and this kind of like uprising across the region of Palestinians, both inside 48 Palestine, in the West Bank, in Gaza, as well as Palestinian refugees across the region in this really unified way we hadn't seen in a long time. I think that this really was the sort of like death of the US strategy to use this Salafi Wahhabi ideology to break the resistance axis, because it reminded everybody of who the enemy is. Because this was after the normalization deals, right? Normalization with the UAE and Bahrain and Israel, countries that were never at war, but somehow made peace with Israel, a country they were never at war with. And, the sort of like unofficial normalization between Saudi Arabia and Israel. This was supposed to lead to a better situation for Palestine, but the opposite happened. And it really like showed the reality of what's happening. I mean, this was the first time in a long time my Iraqi friends were obsessing over what was happening in Palestine, because usually they don't really care anymore. They have their own issues to deal with.
It was the first time I noticed it too, where everybody came together and people united across all political fronts, and we're like,
Mhm.
you know, what Israel is doing to the Palestinians is wrong. It was like a reminder. It was like all of a sudden, people weren't talking about Syria anymore. People weren't talking about
Yep.
what was happening in Lebanon anymore, or even Yemen. All eyes were on Palestine. All eyes were on.
Exactly. And I think that was a really powerful moment, because it just shows that despite all the money and all the weapons and all the jihadi groups, and I mean, it's definitely devastated the region. I'm not trying to paint a rosy picture, but despite all that, people aren't stupid, and they still recognize that Israel is an arm of the Americans and is a destructive force in the region, and they won't accept it. Their stupid, tyrannical governments can accept it all they want and play friends. And, you know, the UAE, the fake country, these fake Gulf countries that like weren't even countries that mattered until they happened to strike oil. Right? Like they can all, I mean, like and it was the first time, you know, you even saw with Jordan. I mean, it was the first time I saw the Jordanian government actually allow citizens to break the barrier to the West Bank. That's what happened. I mean, I really think that this was a turning point. So I think that like it was really the death knell of this US strategy to try to use sectarianism to rupture the central issue in the region, which remains Palestine.
It absolutely, absolutely is. And I think and because Palestine is the issue for Arabs in the region, sectarianism will continue to be used to divide the Middle East. It's going to continue to be used as a tool, but as you just said, I agree with you. I think that tool is being weakened by resistance in the region, and by just people's, you know, hearts when they see the victims of Israeli occupation and apartheid, and just the victims of these Israeli airstrikes in Gaza. I mean, completely devastating imagery coming out of Gaza. Until this day, I mean, over 30,000 people were left homeless. Over 200 people died, including over 70 children in Gaza. You know, Israel is losing the information war, which is why Israel is at the forefront of the censorship campaign and misinformation campaign with social media tech giants like Facebook, and why Israeli censors are sitting on the boards of like Facebook free speech courts, or why the ADL, the Anti-Defamation League, we all love the ADL, right? The ADL is partnering up with social media giants and YouTube. That's why they're going so hard against independent media and independent journalism, and so hard against, you know, smearing alternative journalists like yourself, Rania. It's because we are winning the information war. And so the only way that they know how to do things is by censoring. It's through a very, very hawkish approach. But Rania, thank you so much for joining us today. I mean, it was such a rich conversation. I'm sure so many people learned so much from you. Tell people where they can find your work.
You can find my work at Breakthrough News. You can follow us on Breakthrough News on YouTube. And then of course you can follow me on Twitter at Rania Khalek. And you can also I post most of my stuff on my website, raniakhalek.com. And Mnar, I want to thank you too. It was so nice to like chat with you about this stuff.
I miss you, Rania.
I miss you too. I really do. Thank you.
I know it's been so good talking to you, and we'll catch up too on a personal level. But I just want to let everybody know, please follow Rania and her work at Breakthrough News. She's an incredible, very important journalist to follow. And for all of those who have watched this live stream and enjoyed it, please consider becoming a Patreon member on our Patreon page, and share this where you can to help us beat social media algorithms. And one last thing I just want to say to remind everybody that this live stream will be available on our YouTube channel as soon as it's down, as soon as we go offline, and then also available as an audio podcast within the next 24 hours under Mintcast. And we'll post all of these links in under the live stream. But thank you so much, everybody, for joining us. And thank you, Rania.
Thank you, Mnar.